dollar that entered Afghanistan in the name of rebuilding also bought something else. A little more silence, a little more corruption, and a little more betrayal. For 2 decades, Afghanistan wasn't just a war, it was a business. Billions flowed into the country, not to build a nation, but to feed an industry of contractors, consultants, politicians, and middlemen. And while the world believed the fiction of progress, Afghans lived the reality of collapse in slow motion. I'm Dr. Zahir Mirza, and this is Beyond the Frontline. Today we're talking about the business of betrayal, how Afghanistan's leaders sold the nation's future piece by piece while the world paid the bills. Let's start with a phrase that became famous in Afghanistan: ghost soldiers. On paper, the Afghan security forces had more than 300,000 troops. In reality, tens of thousands of those names didn't exist. They were fake entries on payroll lists, invented so commanders could pocket the salaries. A soldier who never lived was being paid every month, and someone was cashing it in. And this wasn't a secret. Everyone knew it. Afghans on the ground whispered about it for years. But the reports that reached Washington and Brussels painted a different picture. An army growing stronger, a state becoming stable. It was all a performance. Ministries created on paper. Nonprofits created to siphon aid money. Contractors who built schools that were never finished. Politicians who bought mansions in Dubai and London, while villages in Helmand had no running water. The betrayal wasn't just corruption, it was theater. Afghan leaders became fluent in speaking the language foreigners wanted to hear: democracy, reform, rights, governance. The words opened doors to aid. The money bought loyalty, and every Afghan knew the system was hollow. But as long as the performance satisfied the donors, the show went on. The tragedy is that the collapse in 2021 wasn't sudden. It was decades in the making, one stolen dollar at a time. When the Taliban swept into Kabul in August 2021, the world was stunned at how quickly the Afghan state collapsed. Commentators asked how it was possible for a government backed by 2 decades of international aid, trillions of dollars, and the most advanced military in the world to crumble in 11 days. But to Afghans who had lived inside this state, who had seen the fiction of its institutions, the fraudulence of its security forces, and the rot at its core, the collapse was not a surprise. It was inevitable. At the center of this deception was the phenomenon known as the ghost soldier. On paper, the Afghan National Army had over 300,000 men. In reality, it had perhaps a third of that number, poorly supplied, underpaid, and demoralized. Commanders inflated rosters to receive salaries for non-existent troops, pocketing the difference. Politicians and warlords colluded with defense officials to siphon off equipment and aid. The United States and NATO, desperate to show progress to their publics, accepted doctored numbers and glowing reports. The ghost soldiers were not just men who never existed. They were the metaphor for the Afghan state itself. A ghost government presiding over ghost institutions, funded by real money and defended by real lives. This hollowing out of Afghanistan's institutions did not begin in 2001, but it reached its grotesque peak during the post-9/11 state-building project. Billions of dollars flowed into the country under the banner of reconstruction. Some built real schools, hospitals, and roads. Much of it vanished into offshore accounts, Dubai villas, or was laundered through fake contracts and shell NGOs. Ministries were bloated with staff who showed up only on paydays. Provincial governors were appointed based not on competence, but on loyalty to factions. Corruption was not an accident of the system. It was the system. International donors tolerated this corruption because they too were trapped in their own illusions. The U.S. Congress demanded metrics of success: numbers of soldiers trained, districts held, schools opened. Aid agencies produced glossy reports filled with photos of ribbon cuttings and charts of upward trends. NATO generals spoke of Afghan ownership, while knowing that their Afghan counterparts were selling fuel on the black market or diverting ammunition to the Taliban. This theater of progress was a mutually reinforcing lie. Afghans in power lied to survive and enrich themselves, and internationals lied to justify staying. For ordinary Afghans, this fiction had deadly consequences. A soldier sent to defend an outpost discovered his unit had fewer men than promised, no spare parts for vehicles, and ration cards stolen by commanders. A villager who sent his daughter to a school funded by foreign aid found that the school existed only on paper. The building was empty, the teachers unpaid, the textbooks resold in bazaars. A widow who sought justice from a district court learned that rulings went to the highest bidder. People turned to the Taliban not out of ideological commitment, but because at least their courts delivered swift, if brutal, decisions. The Afghan elite who presided over this system thrived in its duplicity. Ministers traveled in convoys of armored SUVs, stayed in palatial compounds, and attended conferences in London and Washington to speak of good governance and reform. Their children studied in Dubai, Delhi, or the United States, while ordinary Afghan children studied under tents, if they studied at all. These officials were not naive. They knew the fragility of their creation, but they also knew that as long as the international community needed the fiction of a functioning Afghan state, the money would keep flowing. The irony was that the Afghan state was most successful at projecting its own existence abroad. Embassies in European capitals spoke the language of diplomacy fluently. Development plans were drafted with the right jargon: sustainability, gender mainstreaming, accountability. Conferences like the Tokyo or London donor summits promised billions more to continue progress. What was missing was the basic legitimacy inside Afghanistan itself, a state that cannot collect taxes, cannot pay its soldiers, cannot enforce its laws outside the capital is a state in name only. The hollowing out of Afghan security forces was the most glaring failure. From the beginning, the U.S. trained an army in its own image, heavy on technology, dependent on air support, and designed to fight conventional battles. But Afghanistan's geography and politics demanded something different. Light, mobile units rooted in local communities, able to fight insurgents with knowledge of terrain and people. Instead, Afghan soldiers waited for American helicopters that never came, dependent on a logistical chain that collapsed once U.S. contractors pulled out. When the Taliban launched their offensive in 2021, many Afghan units simply abandoned their posts. They were not betraying the state. They were acknowledging there was no state to betray. The collapse was therefore not a sudden implosion, but the logical conclusion of years of denial. Washington clung to the belief that more aid, more training, more time would produce a sustainable Afghan state. Kabul's elites clung to the belief that they could continue looting while someone else footed the bill. The Taliban understood that both were illusions. They patiently waited, infiltrating villages, collecting taxes, adjudicating disputes until the moment came when the fiction could no longer be sustained. To understand Afghanistan's collapse is to confront uncomfortable truths about state building itself. External powers can build armies, ministries, even parliaments, but they cannot manufacture legitimacy. They can pour money into institutions, but if those institutions are built on lies, they will crumble the moment external support is withdrawn. The Afghan experiment was not just a failure of Afghans. It was a failure of the international system that rewards appearances over substance, numbers over trust, and speed over sustainability. The tragedy is that there were real Afghans who believed in the possibility of a republic, teachers who taught without pay, soldiers who fought without supplies, civil servants who resisted bribes. Their sacrifices were buried under the weight of corruption and cynicism. When the collapse came, they were the ones left behind at airport gates, pleading for evacuation. The elites who built ghost institutions had already secured their exits. The story of ghost soldiers, then, is not just about fake names on payrolls. It is the story of a country turned into an illusion for foreign consumption. It is about a people betrayed not once, but twice, first by their own leaders, and then by the international community that preferred comfortable lies to harsh truths. Afghanistan did not fall in 2021. It had been falling for years, quietly, under the weight of its own fictions. The Taliban's return was merely the final act of a long-running play in which everyone knew the ending, but no one wanted to say it aloud. If Afghanistan offers a lesson, it is this: you cannot build a state on ghosts. You cannot sustain governance on reports written for donors rather than services delivered to citizens. You cannot expect loyalty from soldiers whose salaries are stolen, or legitimacy from courts that auction justice. Real states are not measured by the size of their armies on paper or the number of donor conferences they host. They are measured by the trust between ruler and ruled. In Afghanistan, that trust was systematically destroyed, and once it was gone, all that remained was a ghost republic, one that vanished the moment the world stopped pretending it was real. That's what they said. Progress, reform, stability. But the reality on the ground was different. Afghans watched as foreign money turned into luxury cars, palaces, and offshore bank accounts. Progress became profit, and stability was a lie. Here's the truth. Afghanistan didn't fall only because of the Taliban. It fell because its so-called leaders, presidents, ministers, generals, and self-styled technocrats, were busy building their fortunes instead of their nation. For 2 decades, the international community poured resources into Afghanistan, and yet the country remained fragile, hollow, and corrupt at its very core. The Taliban may have delivered the final blow in August 2021, but the real work of collapse had been happening quietly and steadily for years, carried out not only by insurgents, but by those sitting in palaces, ministries, and embassies. The numbers alone tell a damning story. The United States spent over $2 trillion on the war, and international aid agencies added hundreds of billions more in reconstruction assistance. If money could build a country, Afghanistan should have been a modern republic with functioning institutions, thriving infrastructure, and citizens who trusted their government. But what did Afghans actually get? Unfinished roads that led nowhere, hospitals that were poorly stocked and incapable of providing basic care, schools that were built on paper but never existed in reality, an army bloated on paper with ghost soldiers who only existed on payroll lists, collapsing in days when tested in the field. Why? Because the system was designed to fail. Corruption wasn't an accident, it was the business model. Contracts were inflated, projects were abandoned, and aid money was siphoned off into offshore accounts, Dubai villas, and Western bank portfolios. Every level of government, from the palace to provincial offices, learned that loyalty was bought not with service to the nation, but with a cut of the spoils. Power was transactional, positions were rewards, and the very concept of national duty became irrelevant. Afghanistan did not fall because Afghans were incapable of governance. It fell because governance was deliberately replaced with kleptocracy. And the betrayal cut both ways. Afghan leaders lied to their own people, telling them that progress was being made, that security was improving, that reforms were underway. But they also lied to their foreign patrons, who wanted good news to justify their interventions. Western governments, aid agencies, and international institutions were complicit because they preferred lies over the uncomfortable truth. They wanted reports that looked like success, literacy rates improving, elections held, corruption being addressed. Afghan officials gave them exactly that in exchange for cash, contracts, and political backing. Everyone involved understood the game. The truth was bad for business, so it was buried. For Afghans, this duplicity was suffocating. Ordinary people could see the reality with their own eyes. They knew that the billions being announced in conferences never reached their villages. They knew that the elite lived in fortified compounds, driving armored convoys while ordinary citizens walked through checkpoints, wondering whether they would return home alive. They knew that the promises of reform and accountability were empty, and they knew that the very officials calling themselves servants of the people were enriching themselves at levels unimaginable for most Afghans. Consider the simple fact that in a country with some of the largest untapped mineral reserves in the world, with billions in international support, millions of Afghans still lacked electricity, clean water, and access to basic health care. Provinces outside Kabul remained decades behind in development. Women in rural areas bore the heaviest burdens, losing children to preventable diseases, while officials in the capital held donor conferences in luxury hotels. The gap between rhetoric and reality widened until it was unbridgeable. The betrayal was not just financial, it was moral. Leaders promised democracy but delivered only manipulation. Elections were rigged time and again. Votes were bought, stuffed, or discarded, with international observers looking the other way, because acknowledging fraud would mean admitting the entire project was a sham. Each election was declared a step forward, while Afghans grew more disillusioned. Democracy was never about giving people power. It was about providing legitimacy to a failing order. Security was treated the same way. Billions went into training and equipping an Afghan army that on paper numbered in the hundreds of thousands. In reality, corruption hollowed it out. Generals sold fuel on the black market, commanders pocketed salaries for non-existent soldiers, and weapons disappeared into smuggling networks. When the moment of truth came in 2021, what looked like an army was only a shell, a force that collapsed not because Afghan soldiers were cowards, but because the institution they served had been gutted from within. Foreign governments bear equal responsibility. They knew corruption was rampant. They knew aid was being stolen. They knew reports were fabricated, but they continued anyway because failure was politically unacceptable. The illusion of progress mattered more than the reality of collapse. The U.S. military had metrics for everything: number of schools built, kilometers of roads paved, provinces secured. None of it reflected the lived reality of Afghans. None of it measured legitimacy, justice, or trust. And without those, no state can survive. This is why Afghans feel abandoned, not just by foreign powers, but by their own rulers. Because the collapse of 2021 wasn't only a military defeat, it was the bill finally coming due for 20 years of lies. Lies told by presidents who saw themselves as kings, by ministers who treated public office as private property, by generals who sold out their soldiers, by donors who preferred polished reports over raw truth. Afghanistan did not fall overnight. It was betrayed in slow motion, one stolen contract, one fake project, one sham election at a time. For Afghans, this betrayal is generational. Young people who grew up after 2001 were told they were the future, that Afghanistan was being rebuilt for them. Instead, they inherited a collapsed state and a return to repression. Women who dared to believe in change now face exclusion and erasure. Families who invested their hopes in the promises of reform now live with the knowledge that those promises were never real. The pain is not just in the loss of territory, but in the destruction of trust. The collapse is also a warning. It shows that nation building without integrity is an illusion, that throwing money at a problem without accountability only deepens the rot, that when leaders trade patriotism for personal gain, the state itself becomes expendable. And it shows that when foreign powers prop up a corrupt elite for their own interests, the people are the ones left to pay the price. The truth is that Afghanistan was not defeated by force of arms. It was defeated by betrayal. The Taliban simply stepped into the vacuum left by a corrupt elite and a complicit international community. They did not win Afghanistan. Afghanistan was handed to them by the failures of those who claimed to defend it. Afghans know this. That is why the anger today is not only directed at the Taliban, but at every official, every minister, every president who squandered the chance to build a real state. It is why the sense of abandonment runs so deep. Because Afghans were told for 2 decades that their sacrifices, their suffering, their patience would lead to a better future. Instead, it led to collapse, exile, and despair. But despair is not the end of the story. The memory of betrayal can also be the seed of resistance. Afghans now understand more clearly than ever that their future cannot be entrusted to foreign patrons or corrupt elites. It must be built from within, by those who refuse to accept lies, by those who demand accountability, by those who place the nation above themselves. The collapse of 2021 was the end of an illusion, but it can also be the beginning of clarity. The lesson is harsh, but it is also liberating. Afghanistan fell not because it was weak, but because it was poisoned from within. If that poison is confronted, if corruption and complicity are rejected, then Afghanistan can rise again. Not as a puppet state, not as a battlefield for others, but as a nation owned by its people. And perhaps that is the final truth. The collapse was inevitable, because lies cannot hold a country together forever. But so too is the possibility of rebirth inevitable, because no amount of betrayal can erase the determination of a people to reclaim their future. The bill for 20 years of lies has been paid. What comes next will depend on whether Afghans choose to build on truth. So when people ask, why did Afghanistan fall so quickly? The answer isn't just the Taliban, it's betrayal. A betrayal by leaders who treated the country like a business deal. A betrayal by foreign powers who looked the other way as long as the lies were convenient. and a betrayal of ordinary Afghans who were told to believe in a future that was never real. For Afghans, corruption wasn't numbers on a report. It was the daily humiliation of knowing your leaders were thieves and the world preferred to be lied to rather than face the truth. That's what betrayal looks like. And that's why Afghans today are not just angry at the Taliban, but at the entire generation of rulers who sold our future. If you're listening, I want you to carry this thought with you. Afghanistan didn't collapse overnight. It was dismantled one bribe at a time. And if we don't tell that story ourselves, history will record the lies instead of the truth. You've been listening to Beyond the Frontline, where we tell our story because no one else will. I'm Dr. Zahir Mirza. See you next time.